Imagine England, mid-14th century. A shadow sweeps across the land, not of clouds, but of the Black Death. It claims nearly half the population, leaving fields untilled and villages silenced. But from this devastation, a strange new world begins to emerge. For those who survived, especially the peasants and laborers, life was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. Before the plague, life for a peasant was brutally simple. You were tied to the land, a serf bound to a lord. Your life wasn't your own. But with so many dead, labor suddenly became scarce. For the first time, the common man had leverage. You want your fields harvested, my lord? You'll have to pay for it. Wages began to rise, and peasants started to taste a new kind of freedom, moving from village to village, seeking better pay and better lives. They began to see a future that wasn't dictated by the accident of their birth. But the ruling class, the lords and the crown, were not about to let this new world take root. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers, a law designed to force wages back down to pre-plague levels and chain peasants to their old manners. Imagine working your fingers to the bone, finally earning enough to properly feed your family, only to have the government declare your wages illegal. The resentment began to simmer, a quiet anger building in the hearts of thousands. This wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. On top of this, England was locked in a costly and seemingly endless war with France, the 100 Years' War. Wars need money, and the crown was desperate. This brings us to the breaking point, the poll tax. Unlike other taxes, the poll tax was levied on every single person over the age of 15, rich or poor. For a wealthy lord, it was pocket change. For a peasant family struggling to survive, it was a crippling burden. The first poll tax in 1377 caused grumbling. The second in 1379 caused more anger. But the third, in 1381, was the spark that lit the fuse. Our story zooms in on a young farmhand, let's call him Thomas, from a small village in Essex. Like many others, Thomas saw the injustice. He worked harder than ever, yet the king's tax collectors demanded more than he could possibly give. One day, a royal official arrives in his village, determined to collect the hated tax by force. When the villagers refuse, a brawl breaks out. The official is thrown out, and the village stands united. News of their defiance spreads like wildfire. From Essex to Kent, from Suffolk to Norfolk, ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, thatchers, begin to rise up. This isn't a mindless mob. It's an organized rebellion with clear leaders, most famously a man named Wat Tyler. Tyler was a charismatic and determined leader who articulated the peasants' demands. They weren't just angry about the tax, they were demanding a complete overhaul of society. They wanted an end to serfdom, the abolition of the hated labor laws, and a say in how the kingdom was run. They weren't just rebels. They were revolutionaries with a vision for a new, more just England. Led by Tyler and inspired by the radical priest John Ball, who preached that when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Yecher, thousands began a march on London. Imagine the sight. A vast army of common folk, armed with farm tools, axes, and longbows, marching on the most powerful city in the kingdom. They were fueled by generations of resentment and a powerful hope for a better future. They weren't just marching against a tax, they were marching against a system that had oppressed them for centuries. As they approached London, panic gripped the wealthy elite. The young king, Richard II, only 14 years old, took refuge in the Tower of London with his advisors. The rebels arrived and found allies within the city, poor Londoners who shared their grievances. They swarmed the city, targeting symbols of their oppression. They burned the Savoy Palace, home of the despised John of Gaunt. They opened the prisons. They dragged the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king's treasurer from the Tower of London and executed them on Tower Hill. For a moment, it seemed the world had been turned upside down. The peasants held London. Desperate to regain control, the young King Richard II agreed to meet the rebels. The first meeting took place at Mile End. The king, showing incredible bravery for a boy of 14, listened to their demands. He promised to abolish serfdom and grant their requests. He issued charters of freedom, and many of the rebels, believing they had won, began to head home. But Wat Tyler and a core group of radicals remained. They didn't trust the king's promises. A second meeting was arranged at Smithfield. Here, the confrontation turned deadly. Accounts differ, but it seems Tyler, speaking with the king, made further demands and was perceived as being disrespectful. In the ensuing chaos, the Lord Mayor of London struck Tyler down, and one of the king's own squires ran him through with a sword. The rebel leader was dead. The crowd surged forward, bows drawn, ready to avenge him. It was the decisive moment. The rebellion could have exploded into a full-blown civil war. But then King Richard did something extraordinary. He rode forward alone, towards the thousands of angry rebels, and declared, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I am your captain. I am your leader. Follow me." Stunned by the death of their leader and the boldness of their young king, the crowd hesitated, then followed him out of the city. In the aftermath, the king's promises were swiftly broken. The charters of freedom were revoked. The royal armies marched into the countryside, hunting down and executing the rebel leaders. The old order was brutally restored. The Peasants' Revolt had been crushed. So, did they fail? On the surface, yes. Serfdom was not abolished overnight, and the leaders paid the ultimate price. But the story doesn't end there. The ruling class had been terrified. They never again dared to impose a poll tax. And though serfdom wasn't legally abolished, the landlords, remembering the fury of the revolt, found it much harder to enforce their old rights. The economic forces that had been set in motion by the Black Death continued to work, and over the next century, serfdom slowly withered away. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a bloody and tragic failure, but it was also a landmark moment. It was the first time in English history that the common people had risen up on a massive scale to demand their rights. They showed that they were not just a passive, silent majority. They had a voice, they had a vision, and they were willing to fight for it. Their courage echoed through the centuries, a powerful reminder that the fight for justice and freedom often begins with ordinary people who simply refuse to be silent any longer. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most dramatic moments. Let me know in the comments what other historical events you'd like to see covered. See you next time.